Up to now in the previous two lessons, we've had to pass the data into either the render page or the partial views. So we had to pass that data that we wanted rendered. However, what if we wanted a fragment of markup to be essentially autonomous? And by autonomous, I mean that it needs a different view model than the view itself. So to state this a little bit differently, we need a fragment of Razor that doesn't rely on the page that's calling it in order to pass in data. What if we could treat that fragment just like any other MVC URI endpoint, any other view in our system, and it would be responsible for grabbing the data that it needs, and this is exactly what child actions do. So in a nutshell, we make a call into the controller, into a controller action result method, and then we inject the result of that into the page that's calling it. So a great scenario for this is something that we might want in common across many different pages, like a listing of categories for our products. So we pass in a URI that is then routed to a child action. The child action performs any of the display logic and the orchestration that it needs, and then returns a view, and then that view is then rendered inside of the view that contained the call. This will become a lot more obvious as we actually look at an example. So there are actually two different ways to create a child action. The first is by calling the HTML helper method render action and the HTML helper method simply action. So we'll take a look at both of those and what the difference is. Again, it's pretty subtle. It's almost exactly like what we saw previously in the previous example. So you can see here I have a new project open, child action example. And for starters, you can see here that I make a call into the action method. So I'm using my HTML helper dot action method, and I'm passing in a string that represents an action name. Now, what it's going to do at this point in my index.cs HTML is to make a call back into the home controller. So here is the action result method for the index page, but then we have this categories. You see how that matches up here? Here we're calling categories, and actually this is the method that we're calling into. And we're saying, hey, get me some categories, and what it will do then is return this partial view instead of returning a view like we normally do. And so this partial view will be called categories, and we can see that in our home folder. So views, home, categories. And we're going to pass the model categories to that categories view. All right, so let's take a look at the categories view real quick. Notice that the model that's getting passed in is an enumerable of category. And so what we'll basically do, again, we're going to use some cool bootstrap markup here, but we're just going to go through each category in the list of categories and then just display the category's name, and then we're going to also give a hyperlink including the category's ID. And we're going to say how many category items, so how many products belong to that category, and we'll just print that into a cool little styling from bootstrap.cs. Okay, or CSS. So let's take a look then at how this actually works. Let's go ahead and run the application. And you can see that we get this little category section off here to the right hand side. So that's what we did when we made that call out to the child action called categories, and this is the result of the categories partial view that we had in our views home folder categories.cs.html. Okay, now the important part of this in the categories action result method is to adorn that method with this attribute called child action only, which means that it can only be called in the context of a child action. You can't just go to myurl.com/home/categories. It won't display anything for you. You'll actually just get an exception, I believe. All right, so now hopefully you understand that flow, and the next question then is, we called it using the action method, but there's also, and let me comment this out here, using the Razor syntax for commenting out stuff. All right. We also have render action. So what's the difference between action and render action? Well, as you can see, render action will actually, and we're getting, let me add that. Render action will return void, whereas the action method will return an MVC HTML string. Now you might be wondering, why are we getting a red squiggly under render action? All right, and well, render action returns void, so it immediately outputs the result of the child action into the HTTP response stream. And so if we use this @ symbol prior to the render action, we basically get a red squiggly because that @ symbol acts as a console.write line of sorts. It writes the variable, the object property, or whatever the result is of a method call to the HTTP response stream. So if we call render action, it returns void, and the compiler says, hey, you can't do that. I have to write something, and there's nothing to write. So if we really wanted to use render action, we have to actually wrap it in a Razor block of code like so. And this will actually work for us. So let's go ahead and just leave that there and then run them both, and you'll see it. We'll get the category section twice, once by using action and once by using the render action methods. Okay. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Now that we put the method call to render action inside of a code block, it's going to insert the output of that child action to an HTTP response stream. Okay, so to make a long story short, you should probably just go ahead and use this unless you have a good reason not to. All right. Okay, so just to recap, in this lesson we learned about child actions and how they can be used to display common fragments across many pages that depend on a different portion of the view model that's independent from the view model itself. The view model here in this case is product, but in this situation, we want the child action to be working with categories, right? All right, so these child actions have their own controller, like we saw in the home controller CS, this action result categories, and we just have to make sure that they're adorned with this child action only attribute. And we use the return partial view to insert just the markup defined in the partial view CSHTML, not the entire layout. So that's why we don't get the underscore layout.cshtml also, because we're only rendering partial view, not the entire view, including a layout. All right, and that pretty much wraps it up. So we'll continue on the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks.